wasn't necessarily Jesus at the time, but this Messiah was coming, were 12 to 1,500 years old. In Malachi, one of the prophecies is that there's one coming who will turn the hearts of the children to their parents and turn the hearts of the parents to their young, which is interesting in light of this past weekend. But between Malachi and the Gospels, when this comes to fruition, there's a 600 period of years where God seems to be silent. But for the Jewish people, he was silent a lot longer than that. Between the promise that there would be one who would come and set them free to the time that Jesus actually walked the earth. That's a long wait. And Advent remembers and identifies with those who are waiting for the one who would come. And we don't like to wait. We get irritated waiting 10 minutes too long at the line at Walmart. The idea of waiting 600 years, let alone 1,200 years, we can't even wrap our arms around that. And what Advent allows us to do, Advent is to remember the one who was promised and the waiting, the anticipation of his arrival. So a lot of churches practice Advent. I don't know if you've ever been to a church that had the Advent wreath and there are 4 or 5 candles on it. And every Sunday somebody would read one of the promises about the coming Messiah. There are some churches actually that don't turn their lights on until Christmas Eve. And they've got them up, but they're waiting and they're trying to, again, promote this idea of taking time to stop and remember. And how interesting it is, at least to me, that Friday forced Advent on us who would be Christ followers. He did, because even as a Christ follower, the question is why? The question that begs to be asked is why? And those of you who are parents or grandparents, and even if you're not parents, we love children. I love kids. And there's another slide. You want to show the next slide? One of my friends posted this of a mother grieving for a child lost. And I found this incredibly moving when it appeared on my Facebook yesterday from a dear friend. I think we're left with some questions, and I wrote some of them out. Why God? Where is God? Is there a God? How does a good God let evil exist in the world? If God is all-powerful, can do all things, why didn't he prevent the young man from getting into the school? Why didn't God cause a truck to run a stop sign? You ever think those things? And take him out? How do we wrap our arms around it? And I've been trying to wrap my arms around it, my head around it, but the only thing that seems to be able to get wrapped around this thing is my heart. And I think many of you can identify with that. So the question I kind of want to ask this morning is simply this: How do I wonder and marvel at the greatness of our God and his story when I can't turn off my horror and shock of the depravity that we experienced this weekend? Now, I'm going to tell you, if you've never asked those questions, you've had a pretty easy life. I'm just going to ask, if you've never asked why God, or where is God, or if there's a God because of something, that you've had it pretty easy. I think most of us have faced tragedy, or lost a loved one, or had something happen to us that was abusive and wrong, and we ask those questions. And I don't know what it means. It doesn't put me I don't get a Superman t-shirt for this, but being a preacher doesn't keep you from asking those questions often. And I've been with families who are grieving, and they ask me those questions, and all I can do is cry with them because I don't have an answer for them. And so I'm not going to answer the question for you, but I want to talk about it, if I can. One of the things that's real interesting to me is, the Christmas story. We're all familiar with the Christmas story. Matthew 2 probably has, and Luke 1 and 2 probably are the primary Gospels when we talk about the Christmas story, and the Christmas story that most of us know of. It's kind of funny because there's these pieces of the Christmas story that never happened. They're not recorded, that, Joseph led the donkey and Mary rode the donkey to Jerusalem. That's not there. The cattle were lowing, the sheep were blind. That's not there. There's just all these pieces of the story that we've kind of brought in to the Christmas story, the nativity scene, that don't exist. But there's a piece of the story that exists that we either quickly dismiss or we read by very I don't know, as quick as we can because we don't want to have to embrace it. And this is what we read in Matthew chapter 2. When Herod, he was the king, realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, the wise men, he was furious and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem, all of them under 2, who were under 2 years and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So you know that this guy was supposed to be the coming king, and Herod, being a secure king, decided, I'm going to take him out. So when the wise men came through, he stopped and said, hey, I too want to worship this king. So when you find him, tell me. And you know the story. They found Jesus, but then they went a different way, so they wouldn't tell King Herod where Jesus was. And so he sends out this edict, and all the children, all the Jewish children 2 and under in Bethlehem were killed. And I just put that on. I mean, come on. Do you ever just think about that? God sends his son, and he didn't prevent this from happening. Do you see? I just want you to know, the questions that we ask today are the questions that people are asking around the time of Jesus' birth. What gives? Then, by the way, that was prophesied. Prophet Jeremiah wrote these words, a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel, and that's a name given to the mother, if you please, of the Jewish people of Israel. Rachel's weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. They are no more. And you know, Jesus was spared. Why? Because an angel came at night, remember, and warned Joseph in a dream that he needed to move, he needed to go. And they left, and so they were not there when these children were taken. It's just interesting to me. A book that I read, Carolyn, did you bring my book back yet? Did you give it back to me probably? Ooh. But anyway, there's a book called The Life of Jesus, and it's a fiction, but it's written by a gal who, in the writing of the book, became a Christ follower. But she talks about what it must have been like with Jesus growing up. And it's interesting because she includes this piece kind of in the story that there were people who were bitter that Jesus was spared and wanted to know why he was spared and the other children were not. And there's that little piece tucked in that story that because of him and his coming, there was this negativity. There was this mourning, this anger. Martin Luther, by the way, in talking about that and then talking about this issue of evil in the world, he quotes this verse, and I don't know if I have this one, but, and though this world, is that the next slide by any chance? If not, don't worry about it. And though this world with devils filled, this is interesting, this is from Revelation 20, should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. But he's talking about this issue of evil and how it's an experience that we have in life. And Luther concludes the song with this: the body they may kill, God's truth abideth still, his kingdom is forever. And so, you know, on a weekend in which we're tragically reminded of the fact that our world is filled with devils, if you please, I want to encourage you. What we're going to do today, and what we're going to be doing actually next week and the week after, is I wanted to just take 3 Christmas songs and talk about what those Christmas songs mean. And this was not one of them, but it's the one I'm going to share this morning. This one was not in my lineup, but it works. I'm going to tell you about a guy by the name of Henry. Henry was a gifted writer and a poet, but his life had not been easy. And he was alive during the Civil War, and at the particular time of this writing, he would experience this personal tragedy in his life. It was July 9th, 1861. The Civil War was already going, had already started. He had already lost his first wife, and then he remarried. And his wife, on July 9th, was cutting the hair of his daughter. And she decided she was going to save some of her daughter's locks of her hair. You ever done that, moms? Or you'd save locks of your, I know Yvonne did that for Rachel at one point, and keep some of those curly locks. And she was putting it into an envelope, and she was going to seal it with wax. And unbeknownst to her, she had some drips of wax fall on her dress, and apparently her dress was already fairly flammable. And this is a day when there wasn't electricity, and they were by this candle. And when she leaned over to get something, her dress just exploded in fire. She didn't want her daughter to get burned. She was already on fire, so she ran into Henry's office. Henry grabbed a small rug and tried to put out the flames. He couldn't, so he grabbed another, ran to the next room, grabbed a rug, put it on her, and then he put the flames out as best as he could. But her burns were significant, and the next day, after asking for a cup of coffee, she died. Now, you have to understand that Henry, in trying to put her flames out, was severely burned as well, and burned it seriously enough that he was not well enough to even attend his wife's funeral. And it burned his face in such that Henry ended up having a beard for the rest of his life because he could not shave because of the wounds that he experienced in trying to save his wife. This is the words from his journal that first Christmas after losing his wife. How inexpressibly sad are all holidays. I can make no record of these days. It is better to leave them wrapped in silence. Perhaps someday God will give me peace. A Merry Christmas, say my children, but there is no more peace for me. I don't know if you've ever grieved like that. Some of us have been there. That's a deep grief. Adding insult to injury, shortly after his wife died, despite his father's anti-war rhetoric, and despite the fact that he told his son he would not allow him to go because he was too young and would not sign for him, his eldest son, Charles, ran away, signed up, and joined the cause. And the next November, a year after losing his wife, a year and a half after losing his wife, the next November, he received word that his son was severely wounded and might not live, that his wounds were significant enough that his life would be forever changed. And so, again, he's grieving. He grieved when his boy went to war. I can't imagine what that's like to have a son in a war as brutal as the Civil War. And so he's grieving the loss of his wife. He's grieving the loss of his son, at least his presence. He doesn't know if his son can make it. He cannot travel to see him. And so in November, he's just in deep depression. And yeah, I want you to understand, the thing that's kind of interesting is Henry was a committed Christ follower. He had a strong faith, but he now, a second Christmas in a row, was wrestling with that. And asking the question, where is God? And does God really care for me? And do I want to hold on to this faith when it seems like life is dealing me blow after blow? So, another year passes. It's Christmas Eve, 1863. Civil War still raging. For the first time now, pictures of the war are being circulated in local papers, so people are beginning to see the tragedy of the war up close and personal. In nearly every little town and village, there is families. People have connections with those who've already lost loved ones. In fact, the Battle of Gettysburg had just happened 6 months before that Christmas, in which 40,000 men died in a period of 3 or 4 days on the battlefield. And so, with the nation grieving, many people are struggling in their faith. Henry realizes he's kind of at a juncture, and he wants to challenge himself to hold on to Jesus in spite of the pain. So, on Christmas Eve in 1863, he begins to write some thoughts and some poetry trying to work through the pain. And on Christmas morning, he doesn't go to sleep, he just writes through the night. On Christmas morning, as he is still writing, he hears Christmas bells chiming that it's Christmas morn. And these are the final words he came up with as he listened, and you know the words. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, Their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. He's talking about this terrible thing is happening. All these terrible tragedies and evil exists, and people are still claiming peace on earth, goodwill to men. Still ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And then he writes these words. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned. Basically saying the sound of war is drowning out this peace on earth, goodwill to men. Goes on to make a couple more statements. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And it's actually between that phrase and this phrase that he begins to hear the Christmas bells. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was a turning point in his faith. He would struggle with deep grief and depression until his dying day. But he held fast. You know, faith is easy when things go your way. Faith is easy when you get what you want. Faith is easy when you don't hurt or ache. But when you experience deep grief and loss, when dreams are never going to be realized, when friends betray you, when love is lost, when you bury those you care about the most, then things get difficult. But that's where faith is, where faith says, I'm going to hold on even when God seems distant, even when God seems harsh, even when God is silent. I choose to believe, and that's faith. And it is not easy. It is not easy. Some of you know the story of Job. And I don't want to get into all of that. It's a great story. But the bottom line is, when he's lost everything, when his wife says to him, curse God and die, he says this phrase, and this phrase has always haunted me, because I don't know if I could say it, but he says, though God slay me, yet will I trust him. That's faith. So, I don't have a lot to share. And what I want to do is a little scary for me, if you know anything, because I've been a high control person. I wanted to open up for people to share one or two thoughts or lines or ask questions. I don't know if I have answers, but I was asked one today. And Diane came to me and she goes, okay, predestination. Oh, jeez. Anyway, predestination is the doctrinal conviction that God chooses whom he chooses and determines what happens before it occurs. Okay? She goes, how do you rectify that with free will in this situation? I said, don't even go there. If you've been around theology at all, that is unresolvable. And I can't answer that. She goes, what is it? And I said, it's both and. And she looked at me like, that's not the answer I want. And I said, someday when we're in heaven, I'll tell you the exact right answer, because I'm going to be asking that question as well. How does it work out that God is in control and we have free will? God knows who's going to go to heaven before those who say yes. How does that work? I said, I don't know. But I believe both, which I guess would make my theology a little bit flawed, because that makes me both Arminian, if you're a theologian, and Calvin, and those guys are not kissing cousins. So I just give that to you. I think one of the things that's just important is that we just allow ourselves to grieve. And grieve with those who, Yvonne and I talked, one of the things that just hits me is we've already got our kids, grandkids as presents, they're already under the tree. And I'm sure that was true for many of these families. I cannot imagine that Christmas will ever be the same for those families. Ever. You know? Because it's not just a loss, it's so senseless. So I just want to open up. If you have something to say or a question, that's scary for me, but that's okay. Sure. Yes.
And during the day on Friday, when we were all shut down, I have one of the kids were asking me questions. I'm here today, how this happened, it happened here, etc. At the time, I hadn't had time to process everything. I was right in the middle of the day, trying to get things rolling. And throughout the whole weekend, trying to think about it, but at the same time, not dwelling on it, because frankly it's difficult. It's not something I ever want to think about with my kids. Often they're even though they're still the biggest person I've ever met, they're still my kids. And I'm thinking that on Monday, when I'm back in class, I'm going to have even more questions and everything like that. And I want to address it. I will shuffle off my entire plan just to help dialogue with kids. I think that's where some people are coming from. Because that actually has something to do with that family and family background. I guess I'm just asking, this has been my prayer for the last few days, but I guess I'm just asking for some intercession as to as this all goes to I kind of run a tight line teaching in public schools about power at the same time. When they start asking me for advice and they're asking questions, it's kind of difficult sometimes. But this intercession could have the right words or the right heart. A lot of kids are going to be very angry and very confused. I'm kind of angry and kind of confused. I don't see how someone could do this.
What's your first name?
John.
John. What do you teach?
I teach AP psychology, sociology, government, and beyond.
Anything else? No. No. You know, I'm appreciative too that you teach those things, because in the context of psychology and sociology, it's a great question. And John, we'll be praying for you, because one of the things is you know, there's a verse. Sometimes there's these verses in Scripture that are hard to embrace. Like the verse, all things work together for the good of those who love God, who've been called according to His purposes. That's easy when you win, okay? Or if things are in question. But in a situation like this, how does anything good happen out of this? And we'll pray for you, because I think one of the things, I don't know about anybody else, but I've been all over on the internet looking at all kinds of blogs. What are pastors doing today? What are people saying? What are some of the people I appreciate? I appreciate one guy who blogged these words. He said, you know, what the world needs to see is Christians grieve. Just grieve. To be real. Not to take stances on issues or try to make political statements or jockey for position or to try to do evangelism, you know, but just to embrace and to grieve those who grieve. So we'll be praying for John. That's awesome. Yeah, Kenny.
This is kind of hypothetical, but say one of the parents or two parents came to you and their child was killed or whatever at this school, and they came to you with a simple question of, we believed in God before and we had faith in everything, why should we believe in him now?
You know, if somebody, because I've been asked that question, okay, before. I would ask just really honestly, what's the alternative? Because if there's no God, and this is all there is, to me that's just despair. Does that make sense? It just would leave me empty. For me, faith is, I don't know how people deal with tragedy without God, because it's hard with God. Does that make sense? And so, I mean, I admit that. Because I get a lot of penetrating questions, tell me why, and I have to say I don't know. Well, then how can you say you believe? And I said, there's a lot of things in life that I don't understand, but I choose to believe. So, you know, it's one of those things where I just say, if God exists, I sometimes I give them an out, if you see why I say that. But for me, I would say God exists, and I don't think God sees life like I see it. I think most of us would readily admit that we see life in this little picture. We see the cradle, we see the coffin, the day you're born and the day you're buried, and we measure life by that, or what's achieved between those two posts. God never looks at life like that. God's always looking at life in the light of eternity. We measure it by years or duration or donation, and God doesn't measure it that way. He would measure it maybe under the connection, being right related to Him and what that means for eternity. I don't get it. I mean, I look at those beautiful kids, and those of you who have children, man, I don't know if you guys watched, there's this basketball player. Who's the guy who used to play for Minnesota Timberwolves, McHale? What's his name? What's his name? Kevin McHale? Yes. Did anybody happen to see the piece yesterday where they showed him, because he just lost his daughter who was 23 through a tragedy. And one of the things is, again, this is secular. When I say secular, this is not church news recording or news reporting, but this guy focused in on, he said this, he goes, this weekend has been a very difficult day for dads. I thought that was interesting that he would say it that way. And he said, for Kevin McHale, it brought everything home. And it shows him with Kevin Garnett before a game, because they used to be good friends and hadn't seen each other for some time. And Kevin McHale, this big, huge star NBA player, just breaks down in Garnett's arms and sobs. You know, just that reminder of loss. Where was I going with that? Dang it, I hate when I'm trying to make it a point and I forget where I'm going. But that realness of identifying, of coming alongside. Man, I watched, and I'm not there, but I cried. For parents who woke up the next day, I mean, nobody thinks that. We dropped her off at school, we're going to go get her. I read another blog about a guy who was going to pick up his kindergartner from school when he got news on the radio of what was going down. And he said he cried all the way to school because he's going to be able to pick up his kid. So I think we just need to be very, very real. And we can't answer. I think sometimes I think John would probably agree, sometimes we want to answer. We think if we'll win if we answer. I think sometimes we just have to be real, I don't know. I don't know.
If somebody was new to the church and they claim to be agnostic or Bible, when they come to church, how would you explain, or how would you be able to make somebody understand the difference between mental illness and evil, especially when they contaminate each other? And explain that to the agnostic. I'm really trying to come to the church and believe, express unity,
I don't know if you heard that question, but he was saying, how do you differentiate between mental illness and evil? Dennis, you shook your head? Did you didn't? Because you have a... man, I was hoping you had something to add. It's interesting, by the way. I'm going to come back, I'm going to backdoor it. Did you happen to see the guy who talked about his daughter on TV last night? And he even, at one point, I mean, the guy was struggling emotionally. But at one point he said, and we need to pray for the young man and his family because they too are going through a loss. And for him to say that in the midst of that is pretty significant. And even the commentators both said, I don't know how he did that, keep his composure, and yet offer empathy and sympathy to a family. Man, I mean, we can use the word evil. Something in this kid snapped. I don't know what kind of pain he must have had in his life. Sometimes, you ever heard Paul Harvey? You get to see the phrase, now you know the rest of the story. We probably will never know the rest of the story. I'm not dismissing him for his actions. But I'm also not... I read something a guy wrote, I wish I could say his name, Steve Stufan, is that his name? I'm saying it wrong. It's a musical artist. What?
Sufjan Stevens.
Yeah, what's his name? Sufjan Stevens wrote a song, and it's about a guy who was a mass murderer, and he simply says something along this phrase. I wish I had it because it's in my notes, but I didn't include it, brought with me. But he wrote a song about this guy, and he says, and I will not, basically says, I'm not going to throw any stones because you do not know what I have hidden underneath the boards in my closet. And basically he was saying, only by the grace of God go I. Who knows, especially with mental illness. When it comes to a chemical issue, a breakdown, the way that the mind works, especially if you have drugs involved or alcohol involved, paranoia, the mind is not rational. Obviously, this young man was definitely not rational. And somebody mentioned to me today, I didn't realize this, that all the adults killed were women. And a lot of them apparently had kind of the same personality as his mom. Most of you know that he shot his mother in the face before he made his way to the school. That's pretty bold and bitter, do you see what I'm saying? That's very angry. Difference between mental illness and evil. Evil exists, and I think evil can easily manipulate mental illness. I hate to say that, but I like the word agnostic. I think most of us are agnostic and usually working through that, and things like Friday put us back there again to work through our faith. If that makes sense, Bill. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, Carolyn.
I know that on Monday, a lot of the teachers at my school are going to talk about this, and a lot of the kids at school know that I am a Christian, I guess that's about it. And when something like this happens, they usually ask me how I can love and follow a God that would let something like that happen. And I think you've already kind of discussed that, but I think when something like this happens, it really does make you ask the question, why should I love a God like that? And I don't know the answer, but there's not really anything to say.
Well, I think the question she's asking is tomorrow she's going to be in school. Carolyn's, I don't want to use the word outspoken because that sounds strong. But her faith is real, and she's pretty well identified by her peers as being a Christian or a disciple. She came out and said, no, I'm not a Christian, I'm a disciple. If you've been here for that series, you get that. And wondering what she does when the people ask, if God allowed this to happen, how could you love that kind of God? It's very interesting. We actually talked about this in that series. We talked about this friend of mine who said that how can a loving God send somebody to hell? Because we're kind of answering that question. And I said, well, that's easy for you to ask because you've never been a parent. And the reason I said that, as a parent, you love your child, but if you love them, you discipline them. And if they do something wrong, you have to punish them. But that doesn't mean you don't love them. And sometimes that's a hard rope to stay on, trying to love your child, to do what's right, and yet knowing when to discipline, knowing when to let them make mistakes, knowing when to forgive and show mercy, and when you have to draw a hard line in the sand and lay down the law. It comes back to this deal, God didn't direct that young man to make those choices. In fact, if you look at Scripture, it'd be kind of hard to say, yeah, God made him kill. That doesn't fit. Death isn't, originally death was not God's plan. And God's 10 Commandments, one of them is, thou shalt not kill. And therefore, that wouldn't be something that was given to, that God would have given him the marching orders to do that. I think one of the things you'd sometimes say, I don't know. I just choose to love God. I don't know. Somebody got an idea come up, but one of the things I might say is, I love my parents, but they're not always perfect. And I understand sometimes the decisions behind my mom and dad or the things that they do, but I love them and I know they love me. And I don't get this. Just tell them, I don't get it. I love God. Why didn't God stop him, cause a car accident, make his car not start, 100 different things that prevent him from being there. I don't get how that works. I would say, I don't know, but I love God, and I feel really bad for those families and for those children. Does that make sense? I think it's all right sometimes for us to say, I don't know. I think too often we as Christians want to have all the answers. And if we're really honest, we don't. Yeah.
I just felt like I wanted to kind of reiterate the message or whatever about how if you're able to stay strong in your faith and share your faith in time of distress like that, I think it's very important that you do. That's the reason I think that I have faith today, is because in a time where I most needed it, somebody had it and shared it, and that's why I have a strong belief in God. And to see somebody going through such a tragedy stay so strong is very empowering. And I think everybody should try to do that.
That's excellent. What's your first name again? Spencer, appreciate that.
If there wasn't free will, we wouldn't have to work together.
What's that?
If there wasn't free will, we wouldn't have to work together with each other.
If there wasn't free will, we wouldn't have to work with each other. Yeah. Spencer and Marcy, thanks. I think that's right, if you get the opportunity. I think one of the things that you should do, Caroline coming back after what he just said, I think it's cool if you say, well, this is how it works for me. How does it work for you? How do you resolve this without God? Does that make sense? Because one of the questions I have a friend who said he was an atheist, and so when a situation happened, I asked him, okay, as a Christ follower, I know how I process that. How do you process that? And I just asked him, because I think sometimes it would be fun to hear what they have to say. How do you work through this? How does this work out for you? A while back, I was dialoguing on Facebook with a gal who was a witch, and she was going through a really hard time, and she had nothing to fall back on. You with me? And so I just said, how is that witch thing working out for you in this crisis moment of your life? And it was kind of a funny line, because I didn't mean to be antagonistic. And she goes, I think faith is a very personal question. And I said, okay, you just shared with me a very personal struggle you're having, and I'm just wondering how your faith in what you say you believe in is helping you work this out. Because I just said, without being too judgmental, it doesn't seem to be working too good for you. And she came back with a line, and then she softened up and said, really, it's not. And so I just think, to put it back, I'd like to know how people process that. How does that work for you? Because for me, it just breaks my heart. But I'm choosing to believe that there's more than this life. I'm choosing to believe that even when terrible things happen, that God might be able to do something beneficial and positive through it. So, yeah, Carolyn.
Well, with a lot of those kids, I think they're so devastated because those children, to them, that's just the end of it. There's nothing more after that. So it's like, well, now the children's lives are over, so there's nothing left. But they're probably, like, I can to their heaven. And that gives me some hope because they're in a much better place than that should be.
She was just saying that for her friends who don't have faith, they would say that's just the end of these children's lives, it's over. And that, Carolyn said, for me, it's that they're actually with Christ. By the way, some people would say, we don't want to get into the theological issues here, but Jesus kind of makes it quite clear if you study some things. He said that when a child dies, even if a child has not at what they call age of a decision, that God takes the children. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before. There are some faiths that say if they're not baptized as a child and they die, they don't get to go to heaven, and that's not, can't be supported in either the old or the new. But I choose to believe, again, that God is in control and He's going to work that right, exactly, outright. But I would ask again, too, okay, it's over for the children, but how do their parents go on? Do you see what I'm saying? I think that's the question, because yeah, their story is kind of over. But if you're a mom and you lose your child, why do you go on? Because if you've been living for the child, the reason for your life is now gone. Does that make sense? So what helps you to move on and still embrace this thing that we call life? Does that make sense? So sometimes it's not just about the dying part, it's about those who still have to go on living part. Kenny?
So when you say you yourself get more upset or feel more emotion for the parents because, I mean, in your heart you think that, the kids that died are going to heaven. So they're taken care of. Are you more upset and the hurt side of you? Is that more for the parents? Or do you understand my question?
Yeah. No, I hurt for the children too. I hurt for the parents. Yeah. But still, there's that loss. Those are beautiful kids. Nobody deserves to die that way. No child, regardless of age, that's not a way a person should ever die. But I can't imagine what the last moments and minutes of their life must have been. Absolutely horrific. And I mean, it just moves me. The fear, it had to be overwhelming. Obviously, he couldn't kill all the children at once, and to see, I just can't imagine. There's no words for that. When Yvonne and I were engaged back in, it was in February of 1978, we went back. Her brother lost a child. Christopher was his name, and he was 11 months old, right? Died of the swine flu. And we went back for the funeral. I didn't know Tim very well at that point, and I didn't know a lot of infants or children. I remember it was a little bit moving because when they had him, you know how they have the open casket, they had him actually, I don't know if he was in the casket, but he was wrapped, remember that? He had his pajamas on and like he was laying there asleep with a rattle in his hand. Now I just want you to know, after my son was born, I couldn't do that. Does that make sense? I don't know how to understand, but once I became a dad, that took on a whole different point. It makes me even tear up now. When you become and you hold a baby, there's a difference as a parent, I think. I'm not trying to say you can't be sensitive if you haven't been a parent yet, but there was a whole different dynamic in my life. And so I don't do children well. I cry if they're having their tonsils out and I have to go visit them in the hospital. I'm pretty, Yvonne will admit it, I'm pretty wimpy when it comes to kids in the hospital. So as a parent and as a grandparent, it just slays me. I can't imagine, and we've got 10 grandkids and our 11th on the way. There will be 20 of us gathered around our table at Christmas on the 26th in my home. I can't imagine an empty chair. And there are parents who are already there. So I think the pain's crossed the board. And I think God's grieved. I think God grieves when we fail each other. Does that make sense? We got a couple more. So is there one more thing you want to say? Hey, Jeremy. Anybody else?
One phrase that I keep coming back to, I don't know if it was from something you had talked about, but for the parents, that there's that phrase that God doesn't give you more than you can handle.
Oh.
Well, I think that it's God gives you more than you can handle, so you rely on Him to get you through it.
That's a great line. Brian was just, I don't know if you heard what Brian said, but there's a phrase that we in church sometimes throw out phrases that are pretty trite, and sometimes we throw them out meaning well, and they were dumb. You ever done that? And he says, can you imagine if a pastor would go up to one of these parents, he didn't say this, but he'd say, oh, God will never give you more than you can handle. Okay, I'm a minister. If I was one of those parents and you came and said that to me, we'll probably have a lawsuit because I'm going to drop you where you stand. That's just harsh. I've had one person say to a couple who had lost a child in a car accident, this is the perfect will of God. You're dropped. I mean, there's sometimes where us pastors need to be smacked, or believers need to be smacked. That does not help us, and God does not kill people. We chose to sin in the garden. We chose to be independent and rebel, and this is all part of that fall. And so anyway, so what do you do with that? I appreciate you said that's a verse we throw out, but one of the things that Brian's added, he says, I don't know if that's so true, because when we can't handle it, we tend to rely on God. And sometimes, I would think, it would feel like that's all you got. Okay? And I think you need to pray for these parents. The harder days, I want you to know, it's terribly difficult right now. We have a couple who lost a son. They're part of our church. He's not here today. And they're not here today. And they lost their son about 2 years ago, a little over a year ago. And the pain is still as real as the day that they got the news they lost the boy. I don't think it ever goes away. It's not normal for parents to have to bury their children. That's not how it's supposed to work. And I don't think you ever overcome the loss. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to do a couple more Christmas songs. And here's what I try to know. If you wrestle and you have questions, listen, be honest with God and say, God, I don't get this. This makes me angry. God can handle it. How can I trust you, God? I mean, if you haven't asked that question, it'll come. Okay? And it's okay, He can handle it. God can handle your doubts. All right? And when you doubt, if you place your faith in Him and you doubt, He doesn't walk. Oh, you're mad. You doubt? I mean, God doesn't do that. He doesn't give us the stiff arm. He doesn't turn His back. He doesn't walk. Okay? Our emotions don't determine it. What determines how God interacts with us is, number one, the unconditional love of the Father that we have through Jesus. And that does not change. All right? So don't be afraid to wrestle. And the other thing is, talk with somebody who can encourage you. Talk with a friend where you can be honest and real. Be sure to have those friends who are going to take you to a place that's better, to help you see the light, to challenge you if you're out of line, to hug you when you're grieving. Because we need friends who pat us on the back. We need friends who kick us in the butt. Anyway, I need both. I need probably more of the latter. So don't be afraid to struggle with your doubts and your pain. Let's pray. Hey, God, I pray for moms and dads, for grandpas and grandmas, for siblings, brothers and sisters, and cousins and aunts and uncles, for neighbors and friends who are overwhelmed with grief, but especially mom and dads who walk by rooms now that are empty and beds that are made, who see Christmas presents under the tree that will not be opened, in places at the table where there's an empty chair, and will we'll have pictures in the future, and a child is not there. And I would pray, God, that somehow, in the midst of this, that they would be able to embrace you. That in the midst of this chaos and this deep pain and anguish and doubt and confusion and anger, that they might be able to see the child who came at Christmas and the life they have to offer. That they'd be able to somehow, in this pain, forgive, because that's going to be a difficult piece. Not only he who killed these poor children, but you, Father, who didn't prevent it. There's a piece that has to be worked out there as well. And I pray that we'd work through our faith as well. And that we'd be able to embrace the Christ of Christmas. And in the midst of a terrible tragedy and death, that we might be able to celebrate because of life. So we lift up these people, not only in NewTown, but across the country, wrestling with these issues of life and death. And I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Oh, you're there.